Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Hiroshi Komiyama. I'm chairman of Mitsubishi Research Institute and President Emeritus of the University of Tokyo. In today's panel, first I will briefly introduce what this panel will be. Then each panelist will make a short speech. And after the speeches, discussions will be made among the panelists. If we have time, then I will ask you Q&A time. 4 excellent panelists are participating in today's panel. Later, before each panelist gives a speech, I will introduce her or him. I have been participating in STS since its establishment. In the meantime, the topics related to the population have always been discussed. That's because the population is a fundamental constraint on the sustainability of humanity, and because the burden on the resource and the environment depends on the population and the consumption per capita. The world population was 0.6 billion in 1800 and increased to 1.6 billion in 1900. 2.5 times increase during 100 years. In the 20th century, it increased to 6 billion, 4 times increase, and now reaches 7.3 billion. We are concerned about the future of the population. However, I don't think that the explosion of population would occur because the fertility of the world has continuously been declining. The population depends on the number of births and the average life expectancy. Currently, in about half of the world, the birth rate is smaller than the birth rate that maintains the current population. This means that in half of the world population will decline sooner or later. One of the characteristics of this panel is that 2 demographic experts join for the first time in the history of STS, as far as my knowledge is concerned. We would like to discuss how the population will change from now on. What should be focused on with regard to population? Even though a population explosion in the future might be avoided, the population will continue to increase for quite a while, with an increase in life expectancy. Can ideals described in SDGs as declared by the United Nations in 2015 be realized? Namely, can we protect human rights, protect the earth, and build a rich and sustainable future without leaving anyone behind? We'd like to discuss that. Focus of discussions will be placed on 4 points. First, what is the global prospect of population size, structure, and quality along with its regional distribution? How will those affect resources and the environment? Second, education, particularly women's education, is known to be the most efficient measure for population control and social development. How has it proceeded in the world? Third, we have advantages of today which couldn't even be dreamed in the past, including information and communication technologies, ICTs, advanced medical technologies that extend the health and longevity, and abundant capital which is eager to invest in markets. Are they used efficiently to solve our problems? Lastly, fourth, how can we improve capacity building to achieve the actions for addressing the issues related to the population and resources? This is the structure of today's panel. Let me introduce our first panelist, Professor Zachary Abdul Hamid. We call him Professor Zachary. He is the science advisor to the Prime Minister of Malaysia. He was named as the first chair of the Intergovernmental Platform on Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services. In 2016, he was appointed as co-chairperson of STI Advisory Board of the United Nations Economic and Social Commission for Asia and the Pacific, ESCAP we call. Professor Zachary, please start.
Thank you, Jay. Thank you for the generous introduction. Ladies and gentlemen, as global population reaches 7.3 billion this year, the percentage of people with a decent standard of living is higher than it has ever been. However, inequality still abounds. 2% of the population own 50% of the wealth. But the gap between the poorest and richest is now filled by a broad middle-income group that scarcely existed on a global scale 50 years ago. More children live to be adults, and fewer adults die of preventable diseases. Yet, before the era of explosive population growth ends by 2050, Earth will hold more than 9 billion people. The challenge that we will be facing is enormous given the limited resources and a vulnerable environment. Ladies and gentlemen, the world is already witnessing the impact of climate change on natural systems. This is translated into the increasing frequency and severity of natural hazards, which led to more disasters due to population growth and patterns of economic development. Climate change is also projected to undermine food security, exacerbates existing health threats, adversely affect water availability, and leads to increased displacement. Since 2008, for the first time in human history, more people live in cities than the countryside. The biggest downside to this transition is the urban sprawl and squalor that often comes with it. It is estimated that today, more than 500 million people in the Asia-Pacific region live in slums. Now, more than half of the world's population live in cities, and by 2050, another 2.3 billion inhabitants are expected to join the urban population. Our cities cover no more than 3% of the Earth's surface, but they are responsible for 2/3 of global energy consumption. Ladies and gentlemen, the growth of the human population and the way we consume things have impacted the planet adversely. The need for food, space, and raw materials has resulted in destruction of habitats. Biodiversity and ecosystem services are declining at an unprecedented rate. We are well acquainted now with the startling prospects. 1 of every 8 birds, 1 of every 4 mammals, and 1 of every 3 amphibians is threatened with extinction. The same is true of 6 of every 7 marine turtles and of 1/3 of our reef-building corals. Some 75% of genetic diversity of agricultural crops have been lost. 3/4 of world fisheries are fully or overexploited. The catalog goes on and on. Ladies and gentlemen, in the coming decades, it is likely that this trend will continue, with more losses expected in livelihoods and assets. This underlines the link between poverty and vulnerability to natural hazards. It also exposes inequity, as countries and populations likely to be most harmed by climate change impacts are often the least responsible for causing them and have limited capacity and resources to cope with the consequences. Now, solutions exist, but none are easy. All will require a generous adjustment between the haves and the have-nots and sustained global cooperation. That sounds like a dream, but the alternative is a nightmare. The enduring lesson of history is that drought and famine feed conflict, and conflict breeds more despair. In order to cope, we need to work together as a global community to develop a common understanding of the problems and the technologies to manage and overcome them. The SDGs, as mentioned by the Chair, agreed by governments in 2015, is a good start. But we need to translate them into action at the local and national levels. As they say, think global, act local. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you, Professor Zachary. Next, I will invite our second speaker, Dr. Ryuichi Kaneko, Deputy Director General, National Institute of Population and Social Security Research, Japan. He is currently President of the Population Association of Japan. He majored in biology and physical anthropology at the University of Tokyo and received a PhD in demography from the University of Pennsylvania. Dr. Kaneko, please start.
Thank you, Chairman. I'm Ryuichi Kaneko, a demographer. In the past discussion in this forum, destructive impacts of population growth on resources have been emphasized. However, populations change not only in size, but also in quality. The latter aspects has not attracted much attention so far. I'd like to talk about how qualitative population changes have much impact on this issue. What is the population quality? First, it's health, which is fundamental in human capital. Second, education. Next speaker, Professor Rutz, the world's greatest authority in demography, will tell us the importance of education. So I will address the health and the longevity issues. If we look back in the 18th century, the Industrial Revolution lit a fire to modernization along with the development of capitalism. A slight improvement in people's health and survivorship preceded these events. Increase of people's certainty for surviving several years ahead made the concept of investment meaningful for the first time in the human history. So this triggered modernization, I think. In particular, the increase in children's survival ratio to adulthood made education efficient as a form of human investment. We should pay more attention to the role of human capital developments in modernization in the past and in making sustainable world in future. Demographers measure the healthiness of a population by means of the life expectancy. According to the latest United Nations estimates, the global life expectancy at birth has been extended by 25 years since the 1950s. It's 53% of gain. In less developed regions in particular, the probability of children reaching adulthood has risen from 68% to 94% for the same period. The efficacy of educational investment for children must have greatly increased. Not only for children, but also for adults in recent years, healthiness and survivorship have been improved so that adults are now enjoying healthy conditions for much longer period than ever. Just a month and a half ago, the world record holders of track sprints, Mr. Usain Bolt, retired from competition at his age of 31 years old. Yet, if his healthy golden period continued even little longer, how far the human records of sprint would go beyond, I wonder. Similarly, what could happen if many of the world's scientists and innovators experience even slight extension of their healthy peak period? Well, okay. On the other hand, the most serious challenge in the 21st century is the global population aging. Currently, the proportion of elderly aged over 65 years is about 9%, but it will go up to some 22% by the end of the century. Social burden of financial and medical support for the elderly with shrinking young generations, so-called population owners, will pose many problems threatening the sustainability of the societies. Many people think that longer lifespan or longevity is the prime cause of population aging. It's not true. Rather, longevity and health improvement is the only hope of countering population aging. In fact, in terms of life expectancy, today's world's average 65-year-old person is 9.5 years younger as compared with the person in the 1950s. And by the end of this century, this difference would go up to 17 years. If we take this rejuvenation effect into consideration, the proportion of the elderly at the end of the century will not be 22%, but only 8.4%, which is about the same as the current level. The promotion of health and longevity may have counter effect against population aging. Yet, in our current social system, unfortunately, these benefits of rejuvenation effect cannot be appreciated because the system heavily depends on the uniform scheme of population separated by calendar age. In reality, individual health conditions vary a lot, even in the same age. So we need a great deal of reforms on the social systems side. Since the full participation from everyone in society is the only way to counter the population illness, we need to rebuild the society in which full demonstration of the individual potential is recognized as a part of the fundamental human rights. With new scientific and innovative technologies, the population itself is our greatest resource. So let's create a society that makes best use of them. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Kaneko. Next panelist is Professor Wolfgang Lutz. He is founding director of the Wittgenstein Center, a cooperation between International Institute for Applied Systems Analysis, the Austrian Academy of Sciences, and the Vienna University of Economics and Business. He has widely published on international population trends. Professor Lutz, please.
Thank you very much. Good afternoon. Demography is a very serious scientific discipline, but it deals with a topic that tends to be rather controversial. Why is this the case? Well, because it deals with things that every person has some experiences with. It deals with birth and death. It even deals with such exciting things as sex, contraception, and with these highly political contentious issues such as abortion and international migration. So there's a lot of political controversy about many of these topics. So the challenge for a demographer is to restrict the analysis to what we can say from a scientific perspective. Much has been said about the Sustainable Development Goals. I have the opportunity at the moment to serve on a group of 15 independent scientists that were appointed by the UN Secretary General to write the 2019 Global Sustainable Development Report that should be presented to all heads of state and government at the 2019 General Assembly, which is, of course, a huge responsibility since this is the highest ever, to my knowledge, mandate for independent scientists in the UN system. It's a document that, unlike the IPCC documents or other very important documents, are not negotiated with governments, but it is the independent scientists who have to write it and present it. And there we are looking at the synergies between the different goals, but we are also looking at what has been left out as a topic. And population was actually identified as a topic that is not explicitly mentioned in any of the 17 goals, not even in the more specific 169 targets. presumably because it is contentious, but yet, as this panel has shown and many other discussions, it is highly relevant for the chances to actually implement the Sustainable Development Goals. So where do we stand demographically? The discussion is often highly confused by the fact that we are really facing opposing challenges in different parts of the world. There still is the population growth issue on the table. And in Africa, for instance, it's a very serious issue. While at the same time, some countries are already shrinking, and many countries, most industrialized countries, are having rapid population aging, as you heard the previous speakers mentioning. So what is more important and what is more dangerous? And well, that's what I'm going to try to highlight briefly, and we can then have more discussion later on. So at the moment, we stand around 7.3 to 7.5 billion. I should say that we don't know exactly how many people live on this planet. And pretending that we know exactly can be dangerous. There is a lot of uncertainty in some of the population statistics in many parts of the world. But the future is even more uncertain. So we are around this, as I said, 7.5 billion. So recently the UN has presented population projections, some other agencies as well, and I'm going to refer to a big global consortium of global change research institutes that have defined a set of scenarios that are called the SSPs, the Shared Socioeconomic Pathways. And they're the middle-of-the-road scenario, which in a way can be considered as most likely, shows that the world population is going to increase by another 2 billion to roughly 9.5 billion, and that will be around 2070, so, and then flatten or start a decline, as in the majority of the world, then there would be fertility below the so-called replacement level. Then there's a rapid development, SSP1, where really it's also if the Sustainable Development Goals are in fact implemented, and there are many health and education-related goals that directly impact on demographic trends, then the world population may only increase by about 1 billion to about 8.6. But this is a very optimistic variant. And then on the other hand, we have the stalled development scenarios where education does not spread further, also health conditions don't improve, including reproductive health. And then the world population could well increase to more than 12 billion. So we have a huge range of uncertainty in the future. And demography is not destiny, as has famously said, but these trends can be influenced by policies. And let me focus on Africa, since the next speaker will also be giving the African context. Africa is a special challenge. Sub-Saharan Africa at the moment has about 1 billion people and will certainly get another billion, but it may even increase to 3, 4, or in the extreme case, 5 billion people. Well, that's a lot of additional people in countries that are already poor and partly still not very well developed and educated. We've heard over this stimulating dinner talk yesterday a lot about how technological innovation could make some of the jobs unnecessary. And here we are really facing a double challenge for Africa. There will not only be these 2 or 3 billion additional people on the labor market, but in addition to that, there will be about 1 billion people coming out of conventional agriculture, and they're also looking for jobs. Now, what is the solution? Well, there is a very clear solution, both for the population growth and for the population aging, and it is a much stronger focus on education, universal education for all girls and boys. Female education is the single most important factor in helping women, particularly in Africa, to starting to want fewer children and actually find the means to having fewer children. This has been convincingly shown for many countries in the world, and particularly in the context of developing countries, this is really the driving force, of course, together with the availability of reproductive health services. But education is also a key for dealing with the population aging, as the previous speakers said. And actually there has been a statement recently by 6 European academies led by the German Leopoldina, but also with the Royal Society and other academies on focusing precisely how can we manage population aging. And here again the emphasis was health on the one hand, but also education to start with, but also continuous education. So what does this all mean for policy priorities? Population policies in the past have tended to focus mostly on the birth rate. What is an optimal birth rate? As a footnote, we've done some models that actually it would not be 2.1 as is usually said, but actually it would be optimal if we factor in the beneficial role of education to have about 1.5 to 1.7 children on average, because then you can invest more in each child, and these children later will be more productive in the rest of their life. So to summarize, for both the developing countries as well as the industrial aging countries, a focus on what I call national human resource management. That should be the population policy of the 21st century. All of the companies have human research management strategies. The state as a whole should also have this. Make sure that you have a productive, healthy and motivated labor force in the future. I think that is the challenge for the 21st century. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor Lutz. Our final panelist is Mrs. Naledi Grace Pandor. She is South Africa's Minister of Science and Technology since 2014, and she has extensive experience in politics, academia, and business. Please start.
Thank you very much, Chairperson. Professor Lutz has said a lot about the African continent. With respect to my own country, we have what is called a demographic dividend, in that the majority of our population is young people. However, that demographic dividend does not translate into benefit for our country, because the majority of those young people are poor, they have no education, no access to skills, training, no access to employment opportunities. So our demographic dividend, which is a feature of many African countries, is actually a negative for young people. And one of the challenges we're confronted with is how do we translate the opportunity of a very young population into a positive development trajectory for our countries. And the one solution is to make far more effective use of education, and also to ensure that our countries invest much more than they're doing in science, technology, and innovation. So as collaborators in the Science and Technology for Society Forum, one of the things we must discuss as we talk about population trends and population development is to look at how we can bring our resources together to bear on building a better quality of life for those who are most in need of development, and how we use science, technology, and innovation to bring changes to many countries that still require development opportunities. I think at times when we deliberate in conferences of this nature, our deliberations tend to be very esoteric rather than practical. And we do not look at how we might bring our intellectual and other resources to bear on bringing about real change in the countries of the world and creating greater opportunities, especially for young people, to have a different future. Many of our countries on the African continent have very large populations, but they exist in a context of poverty. In the north, we have shrinking population. We have an aging population. how do we use these two features of our world in order to create a global community that works together to draw benefit from these features of our society? Because surely we don't want to have an aging population that is slowly disappearing in the north, a young population in Africa that lives in dismal poverty. We need to look at how institutions in the north could be utilized to assist in creating a far more skilled and educated population in parts of the world that lack these opportunities today. One of the other features of the growth in population has been a fairly significant decimation of rural areas in our countries. We have massive urban sprawl. We have huge informal settlements in many of our countries, which are essentially dormitory towns that are shacks with very, very inadequate human settlements. We need to address urban development in a very decisive fashion to ensure that people have adequate human security, that they have housing, that they have energy resources, and that they have adequate access to water. We also need to perhaps be looking far more than we're doing at the moment to what the shape of rural development might be. The Sustainable Development Goals include a focus on agriculture, and yet much of the land in many of our countries is unproductive, is not utilized to enhance food security, and is certainly not contributing to human development. We also need to do much more research into climate change on the African continent, because the ravages of climate change are impacting on that part of the world far more dramatically than many of us understand. With respect to resources and resource allocation, Africa has the greatest amount of mineral resources available to the world, but it is not a beneficiary of these resources because we tend to have extraction of minerals from Africa to be value added in industrial centers in other parts of the world, and then Africa purchases as expensive imported goods refined materials made from its extracted mineral resources back into the continent. So we have to invest in science, technology, and innovation, and in particular in minerals beneficiation, in developing quality health services, and also in the solutions that have been mentioned by my fellow panelists. The issue of education and investment in quality education is absolutely imperative for the African continent. And I think the focus of education should be much more women and girls than we have it at the moment. We also should invest much more in vocational education and training. But I think my final comment would be that if we are to resolve these extremely challenging problems, what we have to learn as the world is to be far more concerned about each other. And we've got to look at how we share resources in order to ensure the development of all our humanity throughout the world, rather than the extremes of wealth that we see in the world today. So I think, as Dr. Hamid said, that one of the challenges we must address is how do we end inequality? How do we transform our population changes into an advantage for the world? And how do we use the world's resources and our own intellectual resources gathered in rooms such as this one in order to effect change which is fundamental and real for the most vulnerable and the most disadvantaged in the world. Thank you very much.
Thank you, all the panelists. And you from South Africa and from Australia, Japan, and Malaysia. We understand depending on the level of development strategy for population and way to consider population is very dependent. But I feel including the two demographers, all the panelists pointed out the quality of the population, the importance of quality of the population. And quality was maybe two other key. One is aging. And even in South Africa, she mentioned about the possible aging, occurring aging, and the improvement in quality through education. This is education and aging. I touched upon very important keywords. Then my question is, does aging decrease resource consumption per capita? Or does education increase or decrease resource consumption per capita? Who will answer? Miss Okay, Professor Lutz, please.
Thank you very much. Just to summarize maybe in another word what you just said, that this transition from just looking at population numbers to also the quality, sometimes you can say we don't only worry about the head count, but we also worry about what's inside our heads. That really makes the decisive difference. And of course, more education empowers people very broadly to do what they think is better for themselves and better for others. That's the most important. And of course, this also is the most important driver then for economic growth. Now, as we know, the richer people are, the more they consume. That is part of what everybody is trying to achieve. That is development, increases in consumption. And of course, with current technologies, increased consumptions also means increased resource use, more greenhouse gas emissions. We, of course, are aiming at green technologies and a transition where we can have gratification and consumption that is lower in terms of material input and CO2 emissions, but at the moment this comes together. So in that sense, of course, education, because it adds to wealth, it adds to income, also tends to have a consequence of more resource consumption. Also, if you standardize, like we have quite some studies that show that at a given level of income, the more educated people are more flexible in their mind to choose green technologies or to change their behavior, such as using public transportation instead of their own car. So in these moves to new environmentally friendly types of behavior, education really helps. Thank you.
Thank you. Next, Professor Zachary raised his hand. Next, please. Please.
I'm not going to respond on your question about aging. I'm going to respond about education. In the first place, I think even in traditional societies, they already have a sense of sustainability. In fact, the traditional local communities have that. But in the modern world, of course, it's different. And I would argue that education, through a liberal exposure of ethics in particular, besides promoting STEM or whatever, would result in citizens who are more reasonable, who can stand to reason, and who can appreciate the vulnerability of what we are facing today. So I think in conclusion, education will hold the key, but the content of that education is the point. Secondly, while I still have the floor, I think I'd like to urge also, this is in response to Madam Pandor observation. Most of the time, our discussion here is more esoteric than practical. I tend to agree with you on that. I wonder, maybe after so many years of the SCS Forum, there might be some approaches that we would recommend, the kind of practical steps that we should take, we should adopt to have sort of an action plan. Yeah. Thank you.
I just checked the time.
Well, you checked the time, so I thought
we
it
have
was time for
only
me to
15
quit.
minutes remain. But no. Very nice comment. Mrs. Pandor.
Yes, I think with aging, the nature of resource consumption would change, and I think the form of institutions and support that you need alters visibly. So I'm not sure that it would decrease resource consumption, but I certainly think it changes the nature significantly of resource consumption. I agree very, very strongly with Dr. Hamid with respect to the content of education, because I was going to, actually, that was my response, that to actually continue to believe that you seek education in order to derive wealth, for me that means you're very poorly educated. You should seek education to improve your intellectual capabilities and then use your resources to improve the world, we hope. I think we need better ethics in the world. There's a great deal of wealth. There is sufficient wealth to be able to share more equitably. If you look at who are the wealthiest and what proportion of wealth they hold in the world, and the proportion that derives to the poorest, it's actually a very disgraceful statement on humanity. And those who hold the bulk of the wealth are very educated people. So education has not led to better values. And I think the content of education and how we utilize our education to create a human being who is interested
Mrs. Pandor,
in the life of others
very
is
short
extremely
question.
important.
Very short question.
Yeah.
Does internet-based education work to improve the education?
Well, if you look at what people are doing on social media, I wonder.
Okay.
I wonder, but certainly there are arguments that it does offer opportunities for broader access.
Okay.
And so I think, again, it relates to the content
human is important.
and to accessibility. But
Okay.
I do think the social media and the way we utilize it has revealed the infant in us rather than our academic potential.
Okay. Thank you. Mr. Kaneko, Dr. Kaneko?
Well, it's just a short answer to the initial question of Chairman. In aging society, the consumption increases. Yes, there's evidence.
Why?
Why the old people use more?
Okay,
Well,
thank you.
there's
It's
evidence,
important
yes.
point.
Yeah.
Okay, I go to the second question. Resources means very widely. I wish to ask, what is the crucial resource in danger? For example, in the last, I think the 2015 STS Forum, I myself mentioned that urban mine is the answer to minerals. It is never a dream, but at the Tokyo Olympic and Paralympic Games 2020, all the medals of gold, silver, and copper will be made from urban mines. And also, we'll make a stadium with scrap iron only. So I think to some of the problems, goal is visible. But what is the most crucial resources in danger, do you think? Okay.
You want to answer?
No, Doctor. Then Mrs. Pandor,
Yes.
please make first.
Thank you very much. Well, I'm not sure whether it would be in danger, but I certainly think human resources face significant challenges. And I think as well food is an area that we're not paying enough attention to. Because we think being in the city, in high rises, will answer all our problems. And I think we have to really pay more attention to food resources, to the natural resources of our planet, as well as to our human resources.
Okay, and I understand. Human capital is now discussed. Education, in particular, women's education is one of the keys. And when you say food, here in STS, some GMO may be one of the potential solutions. But what are you talking about? The sustainability of food production? Is it?
Yes, no, absolutely.
Okay, thank you.
It's sustainability as well as ensuring that we don't go so far with GMOs that actually we cause ourselves problems at a later stage because we're not quite sure what we're eating.
Okay. Then the land area or water issue or such kind.
Well, thank you.
Please.
Yes, I mean, food, I definitely agree that throughout human history, that has been the main human preoccupation with survival, all the famines and all the whole thing with relate to population. The Malthusian concerns have really been about population growth and food security. And this is still sort of close to our minds. Also, as has been said today, it seems to be less of a constraint than it was in the past. And of course, for producing food, you also need water. And something that we're only now getting more aware of is really biodiversity and all the services that the biosphere provides, the necessary life support services. But clearly the human resources are in short demand. It's not as there wouldn't be enough heads, but it's sort of the capabilities of people. I would fully agree with that. And having listened to some of the other sessions here, there may be tempted to say, well, artificial intelligence can partly also substitute for human resources, but certainly only for certain activities. I mean, everything that has to do with more creative activities or scientific activities, to mention our work here, as well as moral judgment, all these things, they need to be by sophisticated brains of sophisticated people and educated people, and that cannot be replaced by artificial intelligence, I think.
Professor Zachary?
I was stumped by a question about minerals, urban minerals. I have not much comment on that. But, you know, in 2005, we released the findings of the Millennium Ecosystem Assessment, in which we found that ecosystem services, those services provided by nature to produce food, feed, shelter, out of 20 of those services, 60% are being degraded as we speak. And that is due to the modern lifestyle, humans' consumption pattern. And if this is not going to be addressed, it's going to be very problematic as the population continue to rise, So, again, I would agree with the fellow panelists here. Our survival must take cognizance of that, and strategies has to be developed. But in actual fact, Chair, there are so many solutions. There's so many solutions. What is lacking is the action, the implementation, or in other words, political will. You know? More often than not, it's the lack of political will that created this problem.
We are here to discuss that, political, academia, and the industry. Thank you. I can allow you 2 questions. Okay, I see the last year's, chairman, Dr. Lee, please. He was chairman of, okay, next, if we have time. Please go to here. Yeah. Sorry. Only 2. And you.
Well, I appreciate very much our discussion. But I want to mention that during one of the meetings of ICSU, we came to the same conclusion. Education is important. Education of women is important. And when we talk about education, one of the teachers from Africa said, Professor Lee, you do not understand. Those students come to school with empty stomach. They don't have strength to learn. And that's the reality in some of Africa. And when we said population increasing so fast, we have to also realize that out of 5 children who are born now, 3 are unplanned children. In the agricultural society, we need labor, probably producing lots of children. But that's the reality now. So Dalai Lama always said, you want to make people happy, you have to educate, so expectation and reality has to be mellowed. And in Africa, reality is pretty bad. And we do not go through the education and said, your expectation has to be lower. But in the overdeveloped country, it's the other way around. Where you have to reduce the expectation to help the people who need to increase their reality. So that's what I'm saying. Things are complicated, but Africa exploited for people in Africa exploited by the West for such a long time. In reality, are really not good. Thank you.
Thank you. I agree with him. Some comment? Okay, please go ahead. Please name yourself.
Yes. Thank you, Chair. Thank you to the panel. I mean, it was very interesting points. I'm Sergio Gariba from the Ministry of Foreign Affairs of Italy. There is, I say, one issue which has been raised by the panel laterally, but I think is very important. The immigrations and migrations. Migration can spoil countries when they concern people who are trained, they don't find opportunities within their system, and they move to other countries. Yeah. They might create political problems and political troubles. Migrations might concern countries within the countries, I mean, from the countryside to the cities. How to govern the migrations. I mean, this is a big issue, the theme of today. Thank you.
Thank you. Very important point. Well, I wish we wish to discuss, but the time is coming. I must conclude this session. Population growth has a big impact on resource consumption. However, although population is increasing currently, the rate of increase continues to decline. And it is likely that it will eventually become saturated, maybe 9.5 billion, probably, if I hear well, the Professor Katz, 9.5 billion. And then it will start to decline as it is now occurring in Japan and quite a number of other countries. The world might be prepared for the current increase of population today and also the decline of the population in the future. If the population and artifacts saturate, the answer to mineral resources will be urban mines, I believe. Also, it is good news that in 2016, 70% of newly constructed power generators in the world was based on renewable energy. This is because economic competitiveness has been improved greatly by science and technology. So we have a vision for in some problems. As such, the solutions, I think I can say, are visible in some of the problems, but still remain many issues. Among them, the future about biological resources or ecosystem stability, and it's a huge issue. And the quality of the population is discussed for the first time of this STS. Important point of view. Aging is inevitable, but it's a challenge, but also opportunities of great potential. We should make the best use of aging to solve the problems synergistically. And societies on different levels of development have different challenge. And so different solutions are necessary. But good education or efficiency of education is a common key worldwide. And education throughout the lifetime of all people should improve the quality of the population and thus head towards solving the population and resource problems by international collaboration through synergies between society and science and technology. I believe STS is the best platform to promote it. This concludes this session. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you. Thank you very much. It's always a pleasure.